anywhere where He wants us to go, and we follow.
And this kind of, you're really good for giving me good segues over to the next point, because that kind of leads us over to Monday's lesson, which points out that what we are talking about is God's pattern of salvation. I mean, we go back to their Egyptian experience. Look how they started out, because in all actuality, if you look at the history of it, they weren't slaves for 400 years. It started out with Abraham, and then to his son, and then it wasn't all the way until after Jacob passed away, the third generation, that they actually went into slavery. I mean, we had Joseph, who was esteemed, like the second highest in the land, and his family was given the same, elevated status. It wasn't until the Jewish nation began to prosper so much that the Egyptians were like, "Hey, we got to do something here," and eventually put it. So about 100 years of that, they were actually in slavery, forced labor, and in this very difficult situation. But think about this. 100 years is a long time in human experience. I mean, if you look at what we all know what, I think most of us know what our grandparents lived through. My parents lived through the Depression. My grandparents lived through the time period before that. And I look at my generation, I look at my children and my grandchildren. Look at the changes in those 5 generations. The values, the culture that they live in. And so it didn't take long for them to come out to Joseph's, Joseph had a very good relationship with God, obviously, until what came out at the time of the Exodus. And so what the people were their mind frame was, and what God had to deal with, was this denigration of this trust relationship that you're talking about. And so we have to look at the pattern of salvation. You have to come out of Egypt. And how do you come out of Egypt? The only way is through God's help. And this is how this is the mechanism, this exodus, this providing of instruction for how to have this relationship with God. This is the pattern of salvation. And so if we read the text we're asked to look at here is Exodus 6:6-7. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from underneath the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with the outstretched arms, with great acts of judgment, and I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from underneath the burdens of the Egyptians. And as Pastor Willis has pointed out, who is doing all of these things?
It's God.
God, yeah. And this is the whole thing about the covenant as we discuss this whole quarter. It is God who is the person who is providing. It is God who is doing the promising. Yes, we have a role, obedience. And we're going to have to unpack that obedience, because there's a lot in our part of it that is a requirement to build this relationship when we get into the faith aspect of it. So when we unpack this pattern of salvation, what strikes you as God's intent for let's just talk about the Israelites at the time. What is God's intent as He brings them through this pattern of salvation at this particular point in time in their history?
Well, first of all, the thing that comes to my mind is His mercy. I mean, he listened to their cries. I mean, they had been under increasing labor, and He listened to that cry. So I think the first thing was just His love and mercy for His people. But he had a promise to keep too, and he doesn't forget that. So the promises he made in Eden to Abraham, that's in his mind, and he has that as a goal for his people as well as we go through this pattern.
Right. Did you have a thought?
No, I think he covered very well. Exactly 400 years, God shows up. And so there are times when we feel that God has forgotten us, he's not on time, but God never does. He never forgets. His covenant stands despite of and in spite of our conditions and our situations. I mean, I keep going back to our own situations, in these last 12, 13 months, when all churches, stopped meeting, basically, in the church building. And I think those of us who are more traditional, who are used to meeting in a building, we were wondering, where is God? But you know what? He's never late. He's on time. He knows when to execute. And our part is to have faith in him, to trust in him, and wait upon his promises. Because he made a covenant.
Right.
This world will not be destroyed by a virus.
Right.
So when he made that covenant, our part is to believe.
One thing that comes to my mind, Chris, this is not in the lesson. So I don't want to muddy the waters. But when they came out of Egypt, they brought part of Egypt with them.
Right.
Now, they welcomed those other people because God obviously has his mercy available to all. But God's people were not yet strong enough spiritually to withstand that influence.
Right.
And that part of Egypt they brought with them continued to be a problem through their next 100 years.
I think Elder Jim is making a very critical point. They brought a part of Egypt out of them, and that part was a thorn in the flesh for them. But when I look at that, the part of Egypt that was really messy for them was the part of Egypt that was in their hearts.
Right. Exactly.
Because God did not wait until they were perfect. So I see part of Egypt on the outside, those Egyptians that said, we are going with these people. But I also see part of Egypt that was in their hearts. And you know what? It's so easy to leave Egypt behind physically, but keeping it in our hearts. And the question is, what are those Egypts, small Egypts that we have in our hearts that prevent us from realizing and enjoying God's full covenant? I think that's a very good point, Jim.
Well, to coin an old phrase, you can take Israel out of Egypt, but it's much more difficult to take Egypt out of Israel.
Yes.
Yes, I see a hand back there.
There's a question on the bottom of Tuesday,
Yes.
and it says, why was the covenant between God and the people of Israel a necessity?
Well, you're fast forwarding ahead a little bit, and we will get to that. But I think when you look at why was it necessary, it was first of all, you had, as we've discussed up to this point, you had these people who were babes in the woods. They were little eaglets. They needed to understand the nature of the relationship of the God that has done all of these things for them. And so when you ask why, it was an element of their spiritual salvation. They needed to understand this God that had led them out and that was providing this spiritual salvation for them. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to bring out something in Monday's lesson. We do have to move on. This notion of Redeemer, Goya. In other words, in those days, if there were no banks, there were, but people would get in debt. Let's just say you had a situation where you promised a certain amount of crops for a certain amount of money. Something happened, you couldn't deliver. You owed a debt. You owed a huge debt. Well, the only way that you could satisfy that was to sell your servitude. In other words, become a slave, become an indentured servant. Well, if you had a family member who if you had a family member who did not want you to go through that, he could ransom, he could pay, and you would and get your freedom back. So this term Goya, this term redeemer that we see here in 6 and 7, that is referring to this process of redemption, and the Goya, the person who provides that redemption. And I just want to throw this out. Who does that refer to?
Jesus himself.
Pattern of salvation.
Yes.
He's trying to inculcate into this culture this notion of you have a God who is going to redeem you. And it's through this whole set of circumstances, the Exodus, coming out of the captivity, learning how to have a relationship with God. It's all part of this notion of the Redeemer, the salvation.
And if I can add there, imagine you have a flat tire and you have AAA on your insurance. So you call AAA, they are on their way, they'll be there in 3 hours. But I happen to stop by, I'm in my jeans, I'm like, Elder Jim, I can change your tire for you instead of you waiting 3 hours here. And I change your tire for you and you're on your way. You'll be thankful. But at the back of your mind, you're telling yourself, well, either way, somebody was going to come and redeem me here. But I want you to imagine you are in the middle of nowhere. You have no signal, you have no cell phone signal, and you have a flat tire. And the car is positioned in such a way that you can't change the tire. And then I show up. The value of my service is different from when AAA said would be there in 3 hours. In this situation, Israel had nobody to redeem them. The quarterly actually says they had no kinsmen to come and redeem them. And so when God showed up, it meant so much to them. It meant so much to them.
Right.
And as the author of the lesson points out, the meaning that you hinted at in the Hebrew is of a kinsman redeemer.
Right.
That someone is related to you, implying God is our Father, Jesus Christ is our brother. They went to the role of redeemer.
Well, when I read this, the first thing that came to my mind is a sermon I gave on Ruth and Boaz. Because when Boaz wanted to marry Ruth, he jockeyed himself so he could be the redeemer, the Goya, so that he could marry Ruth. And as you look in the Old Testament, there's all these different types of Christ. And so this notion of a family, kinsman, redeemer, somebody that loves you so much that they're willing to come in and pay your debt for you. And I think it's significant because, we talk about the covenant and we talk about the establishment of the sanctuary, and what he was trying to give these people is the pattern, the notion, the idea of salvation, and point to Christ all the way back then. We know he pointed to Christ to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. And now he's trying to point to Christ as to the corporate people of his chosen people. And, we can never take that out of the context of what God provides for us through Christ.
And so you put it so well when you look at Genesis 3, Exodus 3, verse 8. In fact, go back to Genesis 3 when men had sinned and God said, I will send a redeemer. You see that throughout history, all these covenants, God is trying to remind them that a redeemer is coming. Even Adam and Eve, when they had a son, I think that was Seth, they thought that he was the one. But now when you get to John, when you get to the New Testament, the real redeemer now has come. Right. So really, I see a progression or the fulfillment of God's covenant. Even though some people want to call it the old covenant, I see it as an explanation of the same covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he goes on all the way to the cross. Now at the cross, that's when the covenant is now fulfilled.
Right. So let's go on to Tuesday's lesson. And we actually get into the covenant. And so if you want to look at if you have your lesson available, there's a very good synopsis of how Exodus unfolds. The first one, Israel's arrival at the encampment at Sinai after being delivered by the Lord. So, you know, they what have they done? They've gone, they've come out of Egypt. They have the Passover. They're the remnant that comes out of Egypt. They go and they get to the Red Sea. They are attacked. God provides deliverance. They get out into the desert, and how much time has passed? It says it right there in this passage. About 3 months. Not long. You know, it's literally a blink in an eye. You know. And remember, it eventually takes them 40 years to get into the promised land. So comparatively, this is a short period of time. They're here at Sinai. And then God proposes the covenant with Israel. In other words, you know, he says from the mountaintop, blessings, curses, so forth and so on. And what did they say?
All that you said we'll do.
Yeah. And so, and I know people are going to tend to be critical of them, but what would you say? I mean, seriously, like you said, you came by and fixed my tire, and we're up in, you know, we're up in the middle of Canada, you know, nobody around for hours. You fix my tire, and you say, you know, am I going to say thank you?
Yes, definitely.
Right. You know, they're going to say, yeah, we'll do that. But it's like any, so now they made their agreement, all right? So it's like if I had a car to sell you for $6,000, you came by and you kicked the tires, you know, you go, you really think it's a good deal, but you don't want to pay that much. Well, I don't know. There's a few scratches here. I'll give you $5,000. And I counter, you know, well, all right, well, I'll see you in the middle. You know, 55. Oh, we've got a deal, right? Okay, so this is what's happened. It's not so much a negotiation, but the terms have been laid out. The people said, we'll do it. So now Moses has to ratify it. You know, we come to agreement, we've cut the deal, but okay, we're going to put this down in paper. I crisscross sell, you know, for the sum of $6,000, because you'll need that when you go to the B&B. You need a bill of sale, you know. So, you know, God has to put this in writing. He goes up, you know, there's a consecration that happens. He goes up on the mountain, and this is when God is writing it with his own finger. And so, as he's doing this, what's happening down at the bottom of the mountain?
They're sinning.
They're forgotten.
Golden calf. They have a wild party.
Yes, ma'am.
Were they serious when they said all that the Lord has said we will do?
I think that they were. Yes.
You know, it just struck me as we've been listening to the discussion that two things needed to happen for the children of Israel that they did not yet realize. And it's true for us today, too. It's the experience. They did not understand their nature. We do not understand our nature. We basically think we are good. But the Bible tells us that we're utterly depraved, right? So they didn't recognize that. So they thought, in all honesty, yeah, Lord. But they did not understand the nature of God either, because they were so used to the heathen gods and their natures. They did not yet understand the nature of God. And we struggle with that as well. Sometimes we doubt the did not understand this. And so they had an opportunity coming up to the promised land, but then they had to go back in and they had to learn a lot of lessons.
Yeah. So I don't know if you can, if you've heard that comment on the TV, but basically boiling it down was the Israelites did not understand their own character, and they didn't understand the character of God and how the two are supposed to operate together. Yeah, one more comment, and then I want to get into our next topic because we're running low on time.
You know, most of the time when we are studying the lesson, we study as a community, as a group, assuming that God, said that this is a chosen church. But the problem of keeping the covenant, because we are different, we are not thinking alike. If we come to think the same way and do the same way, the covenant will be fulfilled. Because right now, we have got two groups of people in the church. Some who comes to church and some who keeps the will of God. As long as we stand in that position, we are not going to do anything. Study the Peter. When he was the first church, he was, people were coming. They came together. They were doing things together. They were contributing as a church. And as a result, they were multiplied at the church of God. Today, the church is stagnant because we think different. Some of the people, they don't think like the way I think, how I perceive God. And some, they feel like, it's just as everybody does. So, to keep the covenant, we should not, we are right now, we are studying as a group. But in that group, there's division. The same way the Egyptian, children of Israel were leaving Egypt, not all the people accepted the call. Because in the wilderness, we found that there were some who started saying, why did you bring us here? We are suffering here. We want to go back, to Egypt because we were eating watermelons. How we were doing this? Because they were just taken by, as a group. Let's go. They were not ready to move. Are we ready to move together as a church, a corporate church, or as an individual? Because once we do that, you will see the church will change. We bring people in the church and do everything.
Well, there's a lot to criticize here. Number one, we should put ourselves in their shoes and make sure that we would be on the right track.
Right.
But my point, before we move on, is there was a lack of leadership. The people that should have stood up failed.
Right.
And I think that's...
You're not talking about Moses. You're talking
No.
about, because Moses was otherwise occupied.
Yeah, his brother.
Right. Well, and so here's the point that in the last few minutes, and just to summarize, to corporately progress as the Hebrew nation did, we have to be of one mind. In other words, once Moses wasn't there to lead them, they were open to division and they went back into their old pattern of worship. And that gives me the segue of where I want to close today. Brother Willis brought up this whole idea of obedience. They said that they would obey, right? Oh, everything you said we're going to do. 2 days later, they were melting down their gold and making an idol. Well, what happened? I mean, and what if that has not happened in our own lives? It was obedience and their idea of what obedience was. Is this just a list of things to do? Or is this the fruit of the faith in the God that led you out? And I have taught many classes. I've heard many great sermons about this whole notion of faith versus works. Unfortunately, we're getting low on time, but look, if they had truly understood the relationship with God at this point, that would have never have happened. And as the Ellen White quote puts in here, it's not the obedience that saves you.
Yeah.
The obedience is the fruit of the faith in God.
Yes.
And this is the whole lesson in this little segue. Why were they melting down their gold and making a calf and saying, this is the God that led us out of Egypt? Why? Think to yourself in your own personal walk. Why have you done that, made that same assumption yourself? It's because of not having a good understanding of your relationship, of your faith in God, and how you obey. And until you screw down on that in your personal life, you're not going to be able to progress in your personal life. And think about, dancing naked around a golden calf. That's a stark thing to think about. But 10 minutes earlier saying, oh God, everything you do, I'm going to obey. You got to have the horse in front of the cart. You got to have the faith to obey, because the obedience is the fruit. It's not the mechanism of salvation.
And I think, Chris, if I can just add there, what I appreciate, and that's not in the lesson, about Moses is the type of leadership that he provided. When he came down from the mountain and he found what was happening, Moses interceded as a leader.
Oh, yes.
And I think as leaders, we need to intercede for people when they get in the wrong path. Moses said, Lord, what will the Egyptians say? Moses knew that these people were sinful, but guess what? As a leader, he stood in the gap and said, Lord, you better take me instead of these people. And I think to what she said, what Chris said, we make commitments, but we forget them and we break them. Go back to your baptismal vows, go back to even your marriage. I wish marriage was like that day when everybody is looking sharp and everything, but then things start happening. But guess what? As long as we keep the covenant at the back of our minds and we work towards that, everything will be fine.
Yes. One more comment, and then we got to start winding down.
You're an attorney.
You're
an attorney.
Right.
There's a legal mindset that goes with that.
Right.
Now, when you draft a covenant, an agreement between two parties, you also spell out the penalties of what's going to happen.
Right.
Were those penalties spelled out to the Israelis?
Well, if you look at the blessing and curses, absolutely.
Okay, and that was fine, yeah.
Right.
Okay, I will bless you if you do this. I will curse you if you don't.
Right.
Okay. That makes sense today. But do they really understand what a curse was?
Well, I can't tell you that because I can't get inside of their mind. But what I can tell you is this: they were operating on a very primitive level of understanding, reward, punishment. That is, you look at the levels of moral development, that is level one. Do good, punishment, do bad, you're punished, do good, you're rewarded. Well, guess what? Bacteria will go will go towards stimulus and away from death. It's the most primitive level of existence, and it's not it's not worthy of beings that are created in the image of God. But God, the good news is God comes to us where we're at. He loves us so much. He's willing to operate with us at that level. And so we have to wrap up now, but I appreciate that question. And the whole thing I find particularly wonderful about this lesson is when we see God's covenant, we see a God that loves us so much that he's willing to be our Redeemer. He's willing to come to us where we're at and save us regardless of ourselves. So you want to wrap up with a word of prayer, brother?
Surely. Let's bow our heads. Father, we are so grateful this morning for your promises to us. And help us to realize our position. We've talked about your people thousands of years ago. But coming down to this year, this day, we are living in Egypt, and it's incumbent upon us to come out of Egypt, at least spiritually, and come back to you with our whole hearts. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, we thank you all for coming to Sabbath school this morning. We invite you to come back for our main service at 11. Go out, enjoy the break, and when you come